Sometimes people have specific demands for political progress. They want to make a difference in the world. They want to make a change, and they go back and re-examine history for that reason. They find themselves mining history, sifting through historical factoids to find bits and pieces of the truth that will suit their agenda today. And sometimes people just go back and re-examine and rewrite history, and they end up finding formerly neglected, unknown, or forgotten aspects of important truth that lead to, instigate, or inspire new movements for political change. I think this is one of the most exciting, interesting, and important political developments to talk about in the writing and rewriting of history, because nobody knows what its significance is going to be. I mean, what are we going to call this new tendency in American history and the understanding of the American Constitution? I sent this guy an email, Woody Holton, asking about the authors of these two books, Michael Clareton, Woody Holton himself, another guy named George Willem Van Cleve. I said, look, when you put these scholars together, you look at this kind of new generation of historians really rewriting the history of what happened to the American Constitution and why it matters, what it means today. You know, what are you going to call this movement? Now, I'll say to you, Joe, I didn't say this to him. I mean, you could say, what are you going to call this? The Constitution is bad movement? I mean, you have a nation of hundreds of millions of people who are raised from birth to believe the Constitution is the best and the greatest thing, not just in America, but in the history of the world. They really do. They look with near religious reverence on the history of the American Constitution and on its present function and significance in the world today. And you have a bunch of PhD-laden scholars rewriting that history and exposing it for what it is. What are we going to call this? The debunking the Constitution movement? Didn't say that. I said to him, look, this is, this kind of breathtaking new generation of historical scholarship coming out in the shadow of the very strange precedent of what Charles Beard published fully 100 years ago. I'll say more about that in a minute. What are we going to call this? We're going to call this the post-Beard movement in history. The anti-Beardists, what is this? Because in many ways what they're doing now is correcting and contradicting what Charles Beard wrote 100 years ago, even though the tendency began with him. And he did send me back a couple very interesting replies I got from this author. And he joked, he said, well, we can call them the clean-shavens. These are the clean-shaven scholars of American constitutional history. My own autobiography plugs into this story in a peculiar way. There was a time when I was young. Hard to imagine, but stick with me. There was a time when I was young, back around, say, 1999. I was in university myself, and I can remember face-to-face verbally insisting on this kind of analysis of the American Constitution with friends and colleagues of mine. I remember one guy who was a colleague in the Green Party. I was involved in ecological politics back then, and city hall, municipal level democracy rather than federal, for various reasons. Wanting to make a difference in the world, wanting to make a difference I could see, and not wanting to do fundraising for somebody else's election, which won't make any difference in the world one way or the other. So I was involved in local politics, ecological politics, what have you. And I remember talking to this guy and saying to him, look, what you don't realize is that the Declaration of Independence is one thing, and the writing of the Constitution is another, and the years in between really matter. And the United States of America existed in those years in between without the American Constitution. And when you contrast the way the American government worked before the Constitution to the way it worked after, it reveals a whole lot about why the United States is the way it is. Now, there's a lot to unpack here. I mean, one of these books alone is 880 pages, and each page is rather large. There's a lot more to say about it than that. But sure, you can dumb this down and say, look, this is a new school of thought that says Constitution bad. The title of this book is The Framers' Coup. Charles Beard, over 100 years ago, planted this seed, set out this idea. In Beard's perspective was that the United States already had a very robust, very inspiring democracy before the Constitution, and that what the Constitution represented was a kind of elite, anti-democratic conspiracy to make the United States of America less democratic than it was, to have a kind of takeover of the slave-owning class, the investor class, the people who owned certain types of savings bonds that they wanted to get redeemed, that it was a conspiracy having to do with making America easier to invest in, especially for British entrepreneurs, British portfolio companies. There was a series of very specific kind of corporate interests, we could say in today's parlance. There were specific financial interests, there was a specific agenda by members of an economic elite, and that there was real fear created by a number of, again, in sort of Charles Beard's parlance, or from his perspective, the sincere, unpredictable democratic nature of the United States in its first few decades was terrifying to people who were members of that elite. Now, I've already sort of hinted, these guys are not fools. The picture you'll get just from this one book alone from Woody Holton is a much more nuanced, meaningful view than that. But already with Charles Beard, again, fully 100 years ago, what we have is the suggestion of a sort of utterly non-Marxist class analysis of colonial America. That there were different social classes with different particular economic interests. Obviously, slave owners are a very different social class from slaves. Well, when you really get into it, the people who actually fought in the Revolution, people who were veterans of the Revolutionary War, they formed a distinctive social class unto themselves to some extent. The people who would benefit from having peace with the Spanish Empire were a very different social class than the people who would benefit from being at perpetual war with the Spanish Empire and expanding. When you start to look at segment by segment of the population, who wanted what? Who was it who wanted to remain strictly on a gold standard, really gold and silver, a hard metals standard? And who was it who wanted to make a transition to paper money? This is one of the most intensely contested debates today. Who wanted a permanent standing army and who didn't? Who wanted a Bill of Rights and who didn't? There was this idea planted, at least at the elite levels of academia, over 100 years ago by Charles Beard, that this kind of analysis could bring about something really revelatory, that this could really reveal to us why the United States functions the way that it does today. And from Beard's perspective, what went tragically wrong when, the Constitution was written. So again, this title is kind of clickbait, The Framers' Coup. The idea that the writing of the Constitution was itself an elite coup d'etat. Now, there were many things Charles Beard was fundamentally wrong about. And I think one of the most profound changes in the writing of history, which will now influence the way we do politics in the present tense and going forward, is just the greater ease of access to historical documents. So really briefly, I used to be a scholar of Theravada Buddhism. That's the orthodox school of Buddhism, a school of Buddhism that's very much based on a textual corpus. So this textual corpus is much bigger than the Bible. It fills a couple of library shelves. It's a whole bunch of ancient texts that 100 years ago were really hard to leaf through and find what you're looking for, even if you have an index. There may be no index. There may be handwritten manuscripts you're working with, whatever your scenario is, right? Well, guess what? You take those two library shelves full of books, you digitize them, you put them on a CD-ROM, or you put them on the internet. You can hit Control-F on your keyboard, and you can really rapidly find every single time the word masturbation is mentioned in those ancient sacred texts. You can find every single time the word slave and slavery are mentioned in those texts. Things that used to be debatable and wrapped in a sort of haze of cognitive dissonance and voluntary ignorance, the difficulty of opinion. Well, who can really say exactly what the position of the Buddha was on slavery? Yeah, well, guess what? Now anyone can hit Control-F. They can go through and read every single passage that mentions slavery, and they can draw their own conclusions. Something similar has happened in the 100 years since Charles Beard was the influential person in this field, in that haze, the haze of voluntary ignorance and cognitive dissonance started to disappear. The enormous corpus of texts left that are either directly or indirectly connected to the writing of the Constitution, Federalist Papers, and Anti-Federalist Papers, which includes personal letters between these people that were preserved in archives and museums, not just strictly legal documents like Hansard's records of formal debates or what have you. Newspaper articles. I mean, the extent to which this guy went through the archives, Woody Holton went through the archives and mined examples of every possible political and economic perspective that were published in the letters to the editor of newspapers at the time. It's brilliant. I mean, it's really useful. But the fact that he can access those things now in a split second, as opposed to actually leafing through paper records, that is transforming the way we understood the past. And it's going to transform the decisions we make in the present and how we look at the future. So the most fundamental misconception that Charles Beard propounded or popularized was that everything in the United States of America was going great. Everything was just fine before the writing of the Constitution, before the elites organized this coup d'etat, as he might put it, or as the title of this book puts it, that somehow the United States had this vibrant, wonderful democracy that was an inspiration, for example, in Europe, but around the world. This was this exciting new idea. Again, ideals espoused in the Declaration of Independence and writings from Thomas Paine, things that are prior to the negotiation of the Constitution, and that then there was this kind of dimming of that optimism as this overtly elitist, anti-democratic Republican tradition took over with the writing of the Constitution. Well, the most basic premise there, that everything was fine, the new generation of scholars are proving that utterly wrong. The United States was a deeply dysfunctional democracy in the years prior to the Constitution. There were very serious and you could say insoluble problems that were tearing the country apart. And you can, in examining this history, you get to question to what extent your own values are on the side of elitism, and to what extent you sympathize with the populists or the so-called Democrats in this situation. Okay, well, probably everyone in this audience would say that they believe in democracy. Taxes are unpopular. People don't want to pay taxes. Some people are literally willing to kill the tax collectors rather than pay taxes. Do you send in the army to force them to pay taxes? Now, again, this is a simplification. You can get the version that's in 800 pages, the version that's in 400 pages. You can read through this history for yourself. But if you don't come to these books with some kind of fundamentally anarchic view that armies don't have any business to existing, that the government has no business collecting taxes to maintain a navy, that the government shouldn't be able to negotiate a peace treaty with the French and the Spanish, like the most basic suppositions about government competence and what it will take to sustain a professional government service of that kind. That is really what's being questioned and called into debate in that period. And you can definitely say that the pre-constitutional period was based on a reckless optimism that the United States was going to be able to have all of the advantages they had grown accustomed to under the British Empire without any of the disadvantages, right? And what they found instead was, this is not surprising at all, they were suddenly cut off from the economy of the British Empire, both in terms of importing and exporting, is that suddenly they were paying much, much higher taxes and they were getting much, much less in return. Right? Before, they paid taxes to the British Empire, but they got the British Navy, British Army. They were part of a world-spanning empire. They would farm tobacco and they would be able to export their tobacco not just east to Europe, but south to the Caribbean, and they would import rum in return and so on. The economics of the United States of America, and this is not even getting into my favorite topic. All of this is linked to the consternation and terror of paper money. So this is something captured in a fascinating way by Holton in his book. What Americans felt in these few years in between achieving independence and before writing the Constitution was that they had paper money that was reliable under the British Empire. That was something the British Empire was capable of doing. But that their own attempts to have an independent paper currency had failed and would continue to be a failure and couldn't be trusted. They were in a situation where they were adjacent to the Spanish Empire that was still very successfully based on silver coinage, the fabled pieces of 8 that you might have heard of in pirate stories of the time. And on the other side, of course, they had the remnant of the British Empire in what would later become Canada, Quebec, etc. They were surrounded by empires that had working currencies. And the United States of America, when it achieved independence, Not only was its own economy decimated by being suddenly cut off from precisely the network of world trade they had relied on before, but also they suddenly had no working currency system. And again, how much do you believe in democracy? Do you believe that the government should just have the right to create money and force it on people, create the terms for debt repayment, government bonds, and so on, and ultimately rely on military force to say to people, look, these are the financial conditions of your life, whether you like it or not? Or do you believe in the kind of really chaotic, anarchic democracy that existed before the Constitution, where, people were able to just physically shut down courthouses? They were able to go through violence just because it wasn't popular. They were able to, both through their vote and through mob violence, prevent the most basic functions of the state on a day-to-day basis, including, crucially, tax collection, debt repayment, maintaining of armies, so on and so forth. Okay, so there's been a kind of profound maturation of the Charles Beard hypothesis, right? So if you say 100 years ago, Charles Beard was saying, the Constitution cannot be understood as the pinnacle of democratic achievement. It has to be understood as a counter-democratic, anti-democratic movement brought about by certain very definite elites. Now, at that level of generalization, this new generation of books coming out is affirming Charles Beard's hypothesis. However, Beard, without being a Marxist, he engaged in this type of social class analysis very clearly to try to vilify the elite classes, to say, well, they were wrong and this is bad and evil. And he's also claiming that there really was no crisis. There was no crisis to be solved, that this was all done kind of with bad intentions. The new generation of scholarship is instead revealing, well, there was a crisis. There was a very real crisis. There were tremendously important problems to be solved. And on many issues, those evil, corrupt elites were correct. There's no point vilifying them as evil. People can be members of an economic elite and still be correct that the government needs to collect taxes, the government needs to pay its debts, that ultimately you can't have a form of democracy in which people can vote the state into bankruptcy, that there's going to be some measure of oppression, including the oppression involved in creating paper money, all of these things that today we take for granted. But what comes out of that today? I've Googled around a lot for reviews of these books. The two I've shown you on camera, George William Van Cleve's 2019 publication, a couple of other books that are part of this new generation of scholarship. And it's fair to say in 2021 that the formal academic book review is dead, and even the formal newspaper book review is dead. But what you find instead are a lot of sincere, informal, emotional reactions to these books posted on the internet. Sometimes from people with PhDs, really, some of them were from career academics. Some of them just from members of the public at various levels of erudition and engagement. And what I saw again and again was people asking, what are we supposed to believe now? What are we supposed to do now? And I'm not American. I'm Canadian. And as has been mentioned, when I was a very young man, because of my own reading, my own research, I was already kind of very biased in favor of this approach to understanding the American Constitution, both in how it was written, why it's written the way it is, why it has the advantages and disadvantages it has. Very fundamentally, people are being asked to shift from having an almost religious reverence for the Constitution as a document that was written to rule over all humanity in all times, in all places, forever, that it was this perfect achievement defining democracy that should remain unchanged for centuries thereafter. And instead, they're being led to a view of it, which, apart from the class analysis, apart from the questions of the elites versus democracy, et cetera, which is interesting in itself, instead, you're led to have a view of the Constitution as a very messy series of short-term solutions to short-term problems that barely made sense, at the time the Constitution was written, and that rapidly became revealed to be complete nonsense, to be a terrible way to govern a country within just 1 century after it was written. You switch from viewing the United States as a country with amazing achievements and an impressive culture, impressive economy, an impressive empire even, shall we say. you switch from viewing the American empire as something that is great because of its constitution to instead viewing it as something that has been great despite its constitution. This is the year 2021. Let me just ask you, what does it say in the Constitution about police brutality? It's easy to complain. Police brutality is terrible in the United States of America today. All right. What if I tell you that everything that's good about policing in the United States of America is not because of the Constitution, it's despite the Constitution? Doing this kind of reading, whether you're looking at the military, the civilian, the judicial aspect, the functioning of Congress, the reality is we're people who have modern expectations of what democracy is supposed to be. And we look for this system created with a series of very strange short-term compromises and stopgap measures. We look for it to satisfy or live up to those expectations when the system itself, the text itself, and so on, is instead truly a shameful relic of a past that is inextricably linked to not just slavery, not just genocide, but the stupidity of this one generation of really highly incompetent individuals who were in no way prepared to take on the task of defining how that country was going to be governed for just the next 10 years, let alone the next 200.